Hello, and thank you for attending my presentation, Power Automate for Pros, 15 Hacks for Any Low-Code Developer. All of these that you should know. My name is Anna Fritsch Weninger, and we're going to take you through my slides. And I hope you can hear and see me. Not me, but the slides. The agenda for today is who I am, very briefly. Power Automate in a nutshell. That will be a very short intro for everyone who hasn't worked with Power Automate before. It's going to be really short, just 4 or 5 slides, and the main content will be 15 useful tips and tricks for low-code developers. And as why you can see the nutshell, this is the intro for beginners, so you can just relax if you know all of this, and as soon as this disappears, we're going to go to the low-code developer pro tips. So just very briefly, who am I? My name is Anna Fritsch Weninger, and I'm a cloud solution expert and cloud developer at ACP IT Solutions in Vienna, Austria, or in Austria we're known as ACP. And my expertise is mostly Power Automate, Microsoft Graph, and PowerShell. So these are the tools and the services that I'm using all the time. And I've been working in IT for more than 15 years, so this is my experience in IT. So here for the beginners, what is Power Automate? Here's the nutshell. Usually people ask me this when they don't know what Power Automate is, and then you explain to them what Microsoft 365 is, what it does, and people don't really understand because they don't know what it all means. So instead of that, they need examples of what you can do with Power Automate. So here's some examples. So for instance, especially when you're working with Microsoft 365 with Power Automate, you can do process automation, mostly within Microsoft 365, but not just. But it's really good to work with Microsoft 365 from within, and you can do very, very interesting things with this, such as, by the way, there's a screenshot here. You can do Teams channel creations and customizations when you start a new project. So this would be project related, or you can do Teams approval processes for large organizations. So when you want to govern something regarding Teams, for instance. Or you can do something completely different. You can do, for instance, a travel expense documentation automation, which is a totally different topic. But you can also do something completely different, which is, for instance, gamification. So training materials could be gamified with process automation with Power Automate. Or you can do things such as auditing processes for Teams owners. So you can see these are very different projects. The first one would be project management related. The second one would be org related, and then we have a finance topics, HR topics, security topics, and so on and so forth. So you can see that with Power Automate, you can do so many things. They are not just for one or a different topic, they're pretty much for everything. And it's just for you to find out what you need to do and how you're going to do it. And as you can see up here, there's a screenshot from this. So this is Power Automate is in a sense a low-code editor, but has a few tricks up its sleeve to make more out of it. If you're interested and you want to know, do you have Power Automate? Can you use it? Why can't I see it? And so on and so forth. There are also beginner presentations that I do. If you have admin privileges, here are some PowerShell scripts. Sorry, there was just someone at the door. Sorry. So there are just some PowerShell commands that you can use to find out what your licensing situation is. But like I said, you have to have admin privileges and obviously have to be able to find out more about your tenant than just a normal user. And if you run these commandlets, you will get JSON, which has all the information for all your users and for the different licenses, and then you can see what exactly they have in terms of flow licenses and what they can do with it. Back to beginners, still in the nutshell, when should you choose Power Automate? That's a question that gets asked a lot because there are some downsides to it. What I usually recommend are basically two scenarios. The first one is especially when you want to start a pilot project with quick results. So when you have to do rapid prototyping, when you have a lot of pressure by management, by different people who have a stake in this, where they just need to see things very quickly, or even to get to a stage where they need swift and quick rollout, then Power Automate is perfect because it's based in your tenant, in your architecture, and you can get from 0 to hero within a very short time span. And the other use case would be if you want to use your existing architecture with minimal additional costs, especially when working from within Microsoft 365. There are a lot of additional licenses, additional external tools and services that you can use to up the ante, but with Power Automate and a very basic ordinary licensing situation, you can have huge impact without any additional costs, which would be the other appeal that you get from this. And what is another thing that I really feel very strongly about is that almost anything is possible. So I've had plenty of scenarios, especially from within Microsoft 365, where people had all kinds of different requests and wishes, and there hasn't been a single project that I haven't been able to solve with Power Automate and, of course, the 15 hacks that I'm going to show you later. So that's a sneak peek of what Power Automate is. Basically, it's a low-code editor, and I'm just going to briefly explain what it makes a low-code editor as opposed to something else. So you can see here on the right side, there's an extract from a flow that I built a while ago. And you can see in pink up here, there is one connector, which is called recurrence. And down there is another pink one, which says apply to each. So in Power Automate, you have classical elements of other programming languages. So for instance, you could have loops, all kinds of loops, you could have conditionals, and all these things that you would usually like to see in a programming language. Then, of course, because it's based within Microsoft 365, you have Microsoft 365 components. So these connectors, as you can see on the right-hand side, which are yellow. And these are crucial because that means that out of the box with what your tenant comes with, if the user who's doing the automation has the according licensing situation, they can use all kinds of connectors from within Microsoft 365 to automate the process, but not necessarily. And the turquoise bits, that's also sort of unique to Power Automate, is that on top of the connectors and everything that you can see here, you can apply formulae and different kinds of prefabricated formulae that come with the system that you can apply to values and variables. So you can not only use the classical elements that come from the programming language, but on top of that, you can also add things like concatenations or UTC now that you see here. So that's the basic setup of it. The reason why it's low code is that these are just stacked in a sequence on top of each other. But as we'll see in a couple of minutes, there is also more that you can do to expand the field a little bit. Just one thing that I should say, Power Automate versus Power Apps. If you're confused by the differentiation between the two, basically, to me, Power Automate is usually a backend solution. So you need other things that provide the user interface for you. Usually that would be if you worked just in place with what you have, for instance, SharePoint or Microsoft Forms, but you could also use other sources as well. Whereas Power Apps is more front-end plus back-end related. You also have a back-end in there because you have your own language that you can put things together, but Power Apps is very much focused on putting together beautiful UI that you can use. I would still say both of them have their place. They're very interesting, but Power Apps comes also with more baggage attached to it and also more intricate license problems. And interestingly enough, Power Automate can be reflected in Power Apps. So you can build Power Apps with Power Automate flows that are working in the backend. And that's why I usually work with Power Automate to keep things as simple but as effective as possible. What are the potential pitfalls with Power Automate? We briefly talked about how great it is and what you can use them for, but since it's all based within Microsoft 365, there are some things that you have to consider. Number one, that's the thing that I said at the beginning, know your licensing situation. So the commandlets in PowerShell that I showed you are useful if you have PowerShell access to your tenant, but you can also find it out through admin centers. And it's very important to know which flow license you have, how many users have the license, because there are connectors that are part of a basic license, and then there are a lot of other things that you can add with, for instance, per user or per flow licenses that are not part of the basic connector set. So it's really important before you start a project, think about what you want to achieve, what kind of things you need to do, and whether that's contained in your license. The second thing is that's a typical dilemma you have in Power Automate. It's all about the connectors. And you always have that choice of whether you want to go with the big spender approach or the do-it-yourself approach. If you have a fairly decent licensing situation where you can work with HTTP requests, you can have custom connectors in there and so on and so forth, then you can basically build everything from scratch. But of course, that's going to take more time and might be more prone to changes because it's, at the end of the day, very complex flows are not that easy to maintain. And of course, for everything that you build, there might be some external solution that you can add to your Power Automate flows that you have to spend money on. So that will always be your conundrum, whether you want to have either the big spender or the do-it-yourself approach. Another thing to remember is Power Automate is integrated within Microsoft 365, which means that if Microsoft 365 is down, then some of your flows may be down. You might still be able to access them, but of course, all the connectors are usually heavily based and depending on Microsoft 365. So for instance, if you work with Teams a lot and Teams has some issues, your flow will also have these issues. So always make sure that you have a good situation of the tenant health and the services health before you start analyzing why, for instance, a flow would take much longer than usual. Another thing to remember as part of the big spender approach, not only with external vendors, but also within tools that you can add from within Microsoft 365, so services you can add from Microsoft. There's a plethora of things that are really intriguing. So for instance, Power Automate can access very awesome AI features. These are called AI Builder and are also available across Power Apps as well, which are really, really awesome, but they're very expensive. So again, if you have some pictures in your mind or some ideas in your head, make sure that you know if you have the license and if you want to invest. And another thing to remember is this is a totally different talk in its own right about request limits through the Power Automate API. But basically the limits are per 24 hours per user. And there's a good chance that depending on your license, you might have enough ranging between 2,000 to 5,000 requests per day that you can send or process. And of course, you can always add more to the maximum. But if you have a very basic licensing situation and you set your automation up in a way that one user creates all the automation processes and has a lot of things that are run several times per day or even per hour, you might run into problems of request limits. So another thing to keep in mind before you put things together in Power Automate is think about whether the process that you're building are something that are going to be API heavy so that you're going to have a lot of requests, or whether this is something that will happen on a daily or maybe weekly basis and have fewer impact. Good. That was the intro section. You can see that the nutshell is now gone. So now we're going to go into the 15 hacks that any Power Automate developer should know. The first one, still aimed slightly at beginners, is start with templates. I'm not a huge fan of templates myself because usually I'm at the stage where I want to build stuff myself, but it's still a good idea if you have an idea in your head and you feel like, oh, this is something I want to build. For instance, you feel like, oh, we should have a solution that should convert Word files into PDF when they're being dragged and dropped onto SharePoint. It's always a good idea to look at the templates first and see if there's something that's already available there. The nice thing with the templates is, even though they don't work as beautifully with all the templates all the time, you can adapt them and you can use them as a basis and make them your own. And even if you're not that experienced, it's a very good starting point just to browse them. There are tons of different examples that you see in there to take it from. Personally, if you're starting from scratch, I would definitely recommend working with templates. But move on from them very quickly, especially because you learn much more if you put your flows together yourself, as you will see in a minute. The second tip I want to give you is make sure that Compose is your very best friend. Why am I saying this? So for anyone who doesn't know what Compose is, basically what Compose does on a very basic level is it's very similar to, for instance, print functions or system out println in Java, Echo, and so on and so forth. So basically it gives you an tool to output content that you're dealing with within Power Automate. So for instance, you can use it a lot for debugging, and that's especially important because what you don't have is a very verbose debugger that comes with Power Automate. So you need to have some kind of tool that gives you the feedback on what you've been putting together before you input something else. So for instance, if you're concatenating a variable that has values that come from very different places, make sure that you put loads of Compose connectors in between to see what the current state of your variable is at the moment. But on a more intricate level, Compose is also useful because it has a sort of inbuilt concat ability that you can use for transformations. So for instance, if you're fiddling with different file formats, or if you're fiddling for, in this example, for instance, you building together a JSON or an HTML, then Compose can be used to put it all together and make it one valid file. And nicely enough, you can also put it in loops and make sure that you add things incrementally. So really make sure that you can make Compose a vital tool for you in the development process. Yes, the third tip would be create what I call, in inverted commas, static variables. What do I mean by that? One very important and wonderful feature of Power Automate is dynamic variables. What do I mean by that? So for instance, if you have any connector in there that does anything, so for instance, you create a new SharePoint entry, or you get a SharePoint entry, as a next step, you're being provided with a list of dynamic variables that come from that previous step, which is wonderful because that gives you automatic feedback of what the connector does. You can already work with the variables. And it's particularly a great tool if you're working with things at the beginning. However, at some point, I think that's a glitch in the system and not by design, but for very complex flows, dynamic variables might disappear, might be hard to find. So you can see in that screenshot here that even though there is a search field that says search dynamic content, if you have very long and complex flows, they might still not be found very easily. And then, of course, you're in a pickle because the name of the dynamic variable might be easy or might be really complex and very hard to guess. That's why it's important. I would recommend that you create a static variable and you save the content of the dynamic variable into that for your most important values. The reason for that being, it doesn't have to happen for all the dynamic variables that you see here. But if, for instance, you know that within your flow, you're going to be working with the UID, the user email, and something third all the time, it's a good standard to make sure that you save them to a variable. And then the big pro of that is that if it's a static variable, as you can see on the screenshot, those lilac variables, so the ones that are called path to file requester. These are static variables, and these will always pop up, or more likely than the dynamic ones. And you can also, if they don't pop up, you can use expression to call them with just variables and then the name of the variable in there, and then you can always request that value. And if you're working not within Power Automate, but within Logic Apps, which I'll be presenting towards the end, you don't have to go that far because there you have an extra framework that takes care of this for you, which is parameters. So basically, because you have fewer functionality available in Power Automate to manage this, this is a way to replicate parameters in Power Automate. Yes, this is what it looks like in Logic Apps. So instead of having static variables, you could be creating parameters that you can use. The fourth tip would be about renaming connectors. There's two things I want to point out here. The first one is just a word of warning, and the other one is a hint as to what common ground would be and a good idea would be. If you look at this excerpt from a flow, you can see here that the first connector here that I have, compose connector, is called this is a static name. And then in my second connector, which is also compose, I'm using the outputs of this particular function, which is great because now I'm going to have outputs, brackets, and then it's going to say this is a static name. However, what usually happens, and if you leave it like this, it's just going to be this name forever. You're going to go on, you're going to work with this, and then at some point you are going through the entire flow again, and you're looking at everything and thinking, this is a static name is not exactly the best name to give it. What happens is if you now rename this to something more useful, sadly, anywhere where you've used the output of this is not automatically renamed. So make sure that you have a good naming strategy in place, and also try and find ways to avert this problem by having as many connectors in place that you can use more dynamically. That would be one tip, or make sure that you start using useful names from the beginning on. Another thing, and that could be also something that you should consider from the beginning when you're putting your connectors together, is some connectors are easy to differentiate, but for instance, right here you can see with this lilac connector, it could be a compose functionality, but it could be something else from the same family of connectors as well, which is less of a problem with the less complex activities, but in particular categories where you have 20 connectors in place, it might be really hard to remember what the actual connector was that you've been using. So one suggestion would be something that you see a lot in flows is that you decide on a good name straight away for a connector, and then at the beginning of the connector in square brackets you can use put the actual default name of the connector. That way, when you're looking at the flow at a much later stage again, you will immediately see what that function is doing before you go into more detail. The next tip I have for you is the use of scope. Scope is a very powerful tool. It's not perfect, but given that you don't have too many maintenance functionalities in Power Automate, it's great to have this in the first place. And what scope does is I use it for mainly two things. One of them being to replicate try and catch that you might know from other programming languages. And the second one is just to cluster information according to or cluster connectors according to what they do. So in a way, trying to put together a method, if you will. So the first one is here you see an example. I have a flow where I'm creating a channel in Teams, and I'm choosing a display name. And the very nice thing is if you now put this into the so-called scope connector, Then you can configure run after. By the way, this is a new feature. You can already configure run after for any connector, but with scope, what you're configuring here doesn't only apply to one connector, but to anything that you put within the scope block. And then when you go into configure run after, you can define all kinds of catch scenarios. So for instance, you could say the next connector should only run if the previous one has failed or skipped or timed out. So this way you can use very precarious requests where you know that they might have a good chance of failing, or because you've already run this flow several times and in debugging you've seen that this causes a problem. Now and then try to use scope to make sure that you configure all the kinds of possibilities that you have here. But make sure that you don't cover your flow in just a bunch of scope connectors, because scope, what it usually does is just a combination of and or connections that you can do, and it can be pretty hard to keep track of what you've tried to avoid or what you've tried to put in place after each of the activities. So my tip would be just use it where in cases where you know that there is a good chance that things might blow. That would be the first use of scope. And the second recommendation, especially if you have longer but less complex flows, would be to use them as a kind of box or collector to put repetitive connectors in there. This is an example where I haven't named them very well, but you can see these are a series of compose actions. And the problem with Power Automate is that everything is displayed as a sequence, so you can see everything underneath each other. And with scope, you can kind of group things and say, okay, this batch of connectors that I'm using here have the same purpose. I'm going to put them into one scope block for a series of related actions. And then when you open up the flow, by default, they are collapsed, so they're not taking away all the space within your flow. The sixth tip would be concurrency control. This is particularly important if you're working with loops a lot in Power Automate. And actually, this is a feature that's good and has a lot of value, but can cause problems if you're using loops in a traditional sense. So concurrency control can only be set up for loops. And what it does is, by default, Power Automate can use, because that's the advantage of being in the cloud. If Power Automate has loops, it's trying to divvy the loops or the execution of the loops up into parallel processes, which means that, for instance, if your loop goes through 200 records, you might have 3, 4, 5 or more parallel processes that are doing the looping for you, which is great. The only problem is if you have some static calculation in your loop, this will be messed up. So for instance, if you're combining your loop with a counter because you want to count some things and you're incrementing the count by 1 each time, then of course concurrency can cause a problem, because now the adding up will be divided up into all these parallel streams and you won't be able to count properly anymore. So this would mess up counters. If this is a problem that's happening to you, it's pretty difficult to spot because it's not an error as such, but usually you can debug this by when you look at your flow after it's run, and it should have looped through very, very different records, and you can see that all the records are pretty much the same, or half of them are being left out. That's how you can tell that concurrency control did its job. But like I said, if you want to shut this down, what you need to do is in your loop, head into settings, and there is this little switch, which is called concurrency control. Oh, I didn't have a screenshot for this. You can see by default, with Power Automate, the degree of parallelism is set to 20, which means that in a loop that counts, you might have 20 tracks at the same time, which could totally mess up your calculations. If you don't want that, set the degree of parallelism to 1. That would be my tip for you. Sorry about the speed, and I'm hearing a lot of noise in the background because it seems that my husband is also presenting at the same time, which is why I thought he was talking to me. So I'm trying to focus completely on you. But that's the downside of not having any doors. Right. The next tip would be OData queries for SharePoint requests. This might be something that comes easily to you if you use SharePoint API a lot. I would recommend using SharePoint API definitely because it gives you much more freedom of execution, options, and custom ways of dealing with SharePoint from within Power Automate. But sometimes you might want to use the standard out-of-the-box SharePoint connectors because they are easier to maintain. And what you can see here is an example of an OData query. So what do I mean by that? When you look at the connector here, which is getting all list items from a specific SharePoint site, by default, if you don't have a filter query in here, so if you leave the field of filter query empty, then SharePoint will get all the items in there, which might be something that you want because you know exactly that you want all of them. But if you have, for instance, a set where you have 2 or 3 or 4,000 SharePoint items, and you already have some idea of how to filter them down so that you get fewer requests, it's definitely important because it will minimize the number of items that go through your flow and will make your flow much faster. So this is where OData queries come in. Like I said, you can use them in different settings in Graph API, SharePoint API, but you can also use it in the standard SharePoint connector. And here, for instance, we would say we're looking for only data where that specific column equals that specific value. And here are some more examples that you can do with OData queries. So you can look for things that are greater than, so you can work with numerical values. And of course, you can also combine things. So you can look for a specific value and then combine them with and or connectors and much more. Eighth tip for you is the use of custom connectors. I won't go into detail how to create a custom connector. Again, that would be a topic in its own right, but I just want to be an advocate for using custom connectors. Basically, what custom connectors do is you can see it in Power Automate in the Data tab in Custom Connectors. You can build your own connectors to a specific service. So, for instance, this would be a Graph API connector. And in that, you can define all your, for instance, Graph API requests and make them available to not only this flow, but all flows in that specific environment. And this is great because now you can see here from that screenshot, you can create custom actions, custom connectors that you can use. So for instance, things like setting a team's owner, get the online status of a user, getting just the owners of a team, and so on and so forth. And as soon as you put this here together, you can also specify what they look like. If you want to add any filter parameters, so for instance, select statements or other filters that you want to use, totally customize it down to your needs, and then they are available for your flows. And the good thing is this is particularly useful if you have activities where, you know, for instance, you will be doing loads of automation with Microsoft Teams, for instance, then it's a good idea to create custom actions within your connector because you know that things like getting all the teams of a user is something that you will be needing time and time again. So make sure you use custom connectors. And one last point on that is that you usually have one free custom connector available even in the most basic of licenses. So as you can see with the knowledge and with the tools, you can extend your license and go much further than you needed to. Just a second, I need to drink something, sorry. I hope my voice is back. Perfect. The next tip is somewhat in line with what I just showed you. Use Graph API. You won't regret it. Again, this is a topic in its own right. I will be holding a presentation on that in 2 months' time as well. But basically, what Graph API does is you have to look at it if you look at Microsoft 365 at a user level, there are very few things that you can edit or adapt. Then if you go into the admin centers, there's a bit more that you can do, but you're still somewhat restricted. And then, of course, the most powerful solution would be to use PowerShell. You can also use Graph API in PowerShell. But with the use of custom connectors, you can also use Graph API within your tenant. And Graph API gives you, in some respects, comparable options to what PowerShell could be doing. And for some things, even more options, because there are some things that are so new to Microsoft 365 that there is no PowerShell commandlet available for this. Usually that's a very vivid process, so things are catching up quickly. But definitely with Graph API, you're on the safe side for especially recent developments. If you want to find out more about this, you can also get in touch with me. There is a blog article I wrote for beginners in German, which has a very nice walkthrough to go through. And there's, of course, then much more that you can do with it. And if you want to try this by yourself completely, I would recommend using the Microsoft Graph Explorer. So Google that, Microsoft Graph Explorer. And in there you get a user interface where you can log in with your hopefully admin or other privileges and can run all the Graph API requests, so get, update, patch, and so on and so forth, and try it out with the actual data from your tenant. And the nice thing about Graph API is that it's not on that screenshot here, but on the left side, you have already a good selection of sample API requests that you can use and put together. And compared to other documentation, the Graph API documentation is really good. So 90% chance that if you're looking for something and you Google something Teams change with Graph API, there's a 90% chance that this can be done with Graph API and that there is documentation for it. Just one word of warning, if you're trying this for the first time, and particularly if you have some level of admin privileges, make sure that you run the queries in here, the first ones, mostly with the get activity, because that doesn't destroy anything or can't change anything in the tenant, but just gives you information. Anything else such as update, patch, or in particular delete will, of course, have impact on your actual tenant. So make sure you use this with care. The next tip, we've already grasped some of this in Graph API, is add PowerShell to your flows. Now, if you remember the introduction from the beginning, I said, yeah, you've got standard connectors, you've got some basic programming capabilities, and you've got Microsoft 365. But of course, with the use of custom connectors, with the use of Graph API, and then with the use of PowerShell, you can make your flows really powerful. You can add all kinds of life to it. And that's when there won't be any problems. If somebody says to you, can you do this? Then the answer will definitely be yes. Again, this needs quite significant admin privileges. And sadly, as of today, adding PowerShell to your flows needs extra setup and licensing. So you have to use Azure Automation, which might not come with your basic Power Automate license, but it's a good investment. And of course, as you can tell by the name, you can see here that this is a service that runs in Azure. That means that you need to have an Azure subscription. You already have, of course, access to Azure through the Active Directory, Azure Active Directory portal, but this actually needs an up and running Azure subscription to work with this. It's really worth the while, because then with Azure, Not only do you get Azure automation, you also get Azure functions and all kinds of things that really give more life and more purpose to your flows. And the cool thing is, once you've set this up, you can run this seamlessly within your environment. So you can put together a flow that has standard connections and standard connectors in there. Then you can use an automation flow. So anything that you're calculating in your flow will then be forwarded to Azure Automation, and your PowerShell scripts can be run in there. And then at the end of this, whatever the PowerShell script's return value is, that can be passed back into your flow. So that allows for a seamless integration, and then that means that you can outsource anything that you can't do within Power Automate, or anything that would be too resource intensive to do within Power Automate. So that would be the absolute pro tip. Take it to the next level and add PowerShell to your flow. The next tip would be, I'm running out of time. Creating end user documentation. Usually when I create flows for my customers, of course, at the end of this, especially if we're working in the customer's tenant, documentation is a big thing. And what I've come to use a lot is I'm just trying to, just as I would with normal code, I'm adding notes and comments to each of my connectors to explain everything bit by bit. So make sure that your connectors are named properly to give an idea of what they do. B, add notes to explain what you've did and why you did it. And this is a way you can use commenting functions for creating process documentation. And usually then I do a video process where we're just explaining the whole flow and recording everything. So we even have a video documentation of that. 12th tip would be use Terminate. Terminate is an inbuilt functionality that you can use in Power Automate, which simply cancels or stops a flow if some condition or something is where you want to stop it. This is particularly important for slow development and debugging, where you want to see what the first part does without having to execute the entire flow. So you can increment things step by step, add some composed debugging functionality. But this is particularly crucial if you're working within logic apps, where each run of each connector costs actual money. So make sure all of the logic apps users that you use terminate functionality. Exactly for loops and incremental development, exactly. The 13th tip would be JSON. Why? Power Automate in its shell is a huge REST service, which means that JSON is the #1 format that is used for transferring data. And of course, you can be working with old data, synchronizing CSV files or Excel files and other formats, but Power Automate is built to work out of the box with JSON files. So whenever you look at any output from any connector that you're ever using, you'll see that it's basically an array with JSON format inside that array. And there is its own connector that you can use to parse JSON if you find it too complicated to find out the actual structure underneath. And even if you don't want to use parse JSON and you have a very complex file like this one, you can always incrementally use all of the values that are in the JSON. So you can see here that you can actually traverse in Power Automate this from body to value and to ID, loop through things and stuff. So it's for Power Automate, it's really nice, easy to use, and it gives you the ability to work with very complex information very easily. I need to hurry up madly. 14th tip, Azure Logic Apps, pros and cons. If you're not familiar with this, Azure Logic Apps is Power Automate in a different setting, i.e. in Azure. You have version control, which is wonderful. You get to use parameters. You have access control, so you can add guests and different kinds of levels of access to your flows. And you have very nice integration with other Azure services. Cons, it comes with the attached Azure subscription, and it's a pay-as-you-go service, which means that every time you run the flow, it's actually going to cost real money, and you need the subscription. And lastly, use all of the inbuilt functions. I said at the beginning that you can add functions such as UTC Now, which gives you the current date, a UID generator, which gives you very lovely standardized unique IDs. You can check for whether information is empty and so on and so forth. And of course, you can stack them all within each other. So really make sure that when you're working with data and you want to transform data, you're using all of the built-in functions. Time-wise, I think I'm bang on the money. I hope there is still time for questions if there are any. Sorry for the interruptions. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions, please mail me. I would prefer being contacted via LinkedIn, so here's a link to my profile, but you can also send me an email, and there is a link to my blog, which is in German. Thank you very much for your attention, and are there any questions? Whew, I had to go so fast here.